Now that's original.
Hey there, and welcome to Original Thursdays. I'm sitting here with my good friend Mr. Josh Griggs in his lovely home, and we're going to bend the rules again just a little bit with Original Thursdays. But before we talk about what song we're doing today and who wrote it, I want to mention that also Josh was featured on the Presley Girls channel along with his 63 Imperial. If you want to check out that video, it's a fun video. And way back on the Blind Pig and Acorn channel, he was one of the first musicians in the Train Song series. You can find that on this channel, but I'll put links in the description below. And then lastly, he was also featured on the Celebrating Appalachia channel, and my sister Tipper did a nice long interview with Josh on that channel. But of course, today we're talking about a song, and when I said we're bending the rules, I didn't write this song. No one in my family wrote this song. None of my friends wrote this song. Not even Josh wrote the song. But Josh, what's the song that we're going to share today, and who wrote it?
Thank you for having me on, Paul. The song is I'm Living in Canaan Now. It was composed by my great-grandfather, the words and the music, sometime around 1937. It was published in 1938.
Mm-hmm.
And he was...
What was his name?
Claude Claude H. Center.
Okay. Living in Canaan Now. So we're going to tell you a lot of details and kind of some backstory about when this song was written. But before we do that, of course, we just want to let you hear the song. So we invited Caleb Dykes to join us, and Josh sang the song, played it on the piano, and we'll let you see that. And we didn't rehearse it or anything, but we did do a couple of takes. The one you're about to see was the second take, and at the very end of the video, we'll also share the first take with you.
Paul and Josh, outlaws.
Oh, yeah. Fraudulent raffle across state lines.
I would have been your probation officer, so.
That's right.
We just met you earlier.
There you
Met you
go.
earlier. That's right. Just different circumstances.
We doing this again?
Yeah, let's do
Okay.
it. Hey, should I, very last line of the verse, should I sing tenor there on that?
Yes.
I did once, and then I didn't the next
Yeah,
time.
keep
and
doing
that
it,
probably
yeah.
threw you.
No, keep
So the
going.
last line of the first verse is,
I'm living
Okay.
in Canaan now.
is that the last line of the second
then-
verse too?
Huh?
Is the second verse in that way too?
Yes.
Awesome.
They
Okay,
all
simple.
in that way.
Simple.
Egypt was once my home, I was a slave, helpless and sin did roam, the fight did crave, but when I looked up to heaven's door, Christ came to save. I'm living in Canaan now, living in Canaan now,
Egypt behind,
cross over Jordan wide,
gladness to find.
my soul is satisfied, no longer I'm blind, living with Jesus up in Canaan right now. Satan may have you bound with fetters strong. Look up to higher ground. Will not be long when Christ the Savior your soul is found. You'll sing this song. I'm living in Canaan now. Living in Canaan now.
Egypt behind,
Cross over Jordan wide.
gladness to find.
My soul is satisfied. No longer I am blind. Living with Jesus up in Canaan right now.
Yeah.
That was fun. All right, we hope you enjoyed watching that anywhere close to as much as we enjoyed doing it. It was a lot of fun. Just had some great fellowship there. You might have seen our pizza boxes in the in the background.
You fed us good.
Yeah, we were just having a big old time eating pizza and singing the song. Before we talk about the song, though, tell us a little bit more about your great-grandfather. What did he do? What kind of guy was he?
He grew up in the Copper Basin. His great uncles were in business partners with the Abernathy family. They had Center and Abernathy's furniture store and funeral home down in Copper Hill. He worked for that for a short period of time. Everybody grew up hard in those days, but he was a very successful businessman. Married my great grandmother, and they went into business for themselves with a store. They started selling general dry goods and merchandise. Along about 1932, they had a son born. His name was William, and he lived about a day or two and then passed away. And then, of course, that was devastating to them at that time. Then a few years later, they had my grandfather, Curtis Hayden Center, and he grew up into adulthood and was very successful as well.
Was also a musician too,
yes.
Right? And made gospel music, had a band.
Yes. They traveled everywhere, did every revival between here and Timbuktu. Traveled around, sang a lot, made a lot of music, and continued on in the store all up through the late 1980s.
I'm looking forward to hearing some of his music, some of his group's music. You had told me you've got some reel-to-reels. I happen to have a reel-to-reel player, so you're maybe going to entrust me with some of those recordings.
We'd like to get them copied over, yes.
And I can listen to them and, get them on CD. To back up just a little bit, Josh and I just had a great lunch a moment ago at the El Rio Mexican restaurant here in downtown
Copper
Hill, and ran into one of our best buddies there. Steve Simons just happened to be walking by on the sidewalk. We got him in there, and he ate with us too. But in that very restaurant is one of the places where your great-grandfather worked. Is that right?
Yeah, the restaurant itself, that building was the original Center and Abernathy's building. And full disclosure, my great-great-great-grandparents' store, where they were in business partners with the Abernathys, that later became Abernathy's Furniture, and I married their great-great-great-granddaughter. So my wife was Katrina Abernathy Griggs now, and so we got together. So
it's cool, all those connections, and we're going to share some photos, as we're talking, and we really get into kind of the meat of what was going on when the song was written. And we'll show you some pictures if, at some point in the video of that building. So your great-grandfather was working in that building for his uncles.
Yes.
Okay. And then he later went into business for himself and had his own stores.
And as a young man, he briefly worked for the Tennessee Copper Company for a while, so to get some money together. So he worked as a guard for Tennessee Copper for a few years.
Very cool. And a couple of my uncles worked for the copper mines there too. Of course, that was such a booming thing for such a long time and provided employment to so many families and livelihoods.
It was the economic engine of this area, yes.
And you were talking about would have been your great uncle, I guess, died very early. Could have been Sid's, who knows.
Lived just a day or two, yes.
And then, of course, Curtis, your grandfather, survived and, as we were saying, went on to be a musician himself. Now, coming back to your great-grandfather, backing up again just a little bit, he was also a member, I don't know, maybe a founding member, but he was a member of the Copper Hill Quartet.
Yes.
And we'll share a photo of that group. And when we started doing a little research for this video and kind of digging deeper and deeper, it's almost like musical archaeology. we came across a recording of that quartet, the Copper Hill Quartet, on Columbia. I was very impressed.
Columbia label.
You know, you're talking about the same label that later was recording Marty Robbins and people like that. And we saw that some of those recordings are still available on Amazon. And I listened to the one song, was it Nothing But the Blood, or?
It's There Is a Fountain.
There Is a
Filled with blood.
Fountain.
Yeah.
I get those two songs confused.
Lose all their guilty stains. Yeah.
And it was very fascinating to me because you and I are both big fans of the movie, although it's, I warn you right now, if you haven't seen it, it's profanity ridden, but it's still a very good movie, The Lady Killers.
By the Coen brothers.
Coen brothers, great movie. And hearing that old recording of your great-grandfather and the Copper Hill Quartet really put me in the mind of the quartets that you hear in the soundtrack to that movie, particularly the group that sang without any music. They just did a cappella, and they began with the notes, the fa and the low and all that.
Singing schools.
Yeah. And so with the recording that I was able to hear of the Copper Hill Quartet, they weren't a cappella, but the piano got very quiet and kind of receded into the background while they sang. Then when they would finish a verse or a chorus, then the piano would kind of come back up, you know,
Play a
to
bridge.
the forefront. Yeah. So.
And he was their piano player.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
he played the piano for
See,
them.
I didn't know that. I'm learning so much through this video. Now, the song became, your grandfather wrote many other songs, but this song is the most well-known song, been played all over the world. And not too long ago, I got to meet Mr. Doyle Dykes, as everybody knows who's watching this channel. And I took one of your guitars along, and Doyle was kind enough to sign that. And as he's signing it, I say, you know, the gentleman that you're signing that guitar for, my friend, well, his great-grandfather wrote Living in Canaan Now, and Doyle was blown away by that and said that happens to be his wife, Rita, her favorite song. She plays it all the time. And Doyle, being Doyle, he just took a knee right there in the gravel and even played part of the song and let me video that for you, which was kind of a thrill for us both. I love it. Thank you.
Man.
And through that conversation and then returning your guitar to you and telling you about what Doyle said about the song, then I started to kind of dig more and ask more questions. When you hear the opening of that song, well, before I get into that, let me tell you about some more about the popularity of the song and how the song has spread. So it was published by Stamps Baxter in 1938. It's in a ton of church hymnals. In fact, in the video you watched of Josh performing the song along with Caleb Dykes and myself, you'll see that I'm singing from a church hymnal because I wasn't familiar with the with the song. And Josh invited me to try to attempt a little tenor, so I ran.
He
and
did
got
good too.
Got that hymnal right there. It was page 287. I think it was.
287 in the red back hymnal.
So it's really out there a lot. And Stamps Baxter, I noticed they have a gospel singing school, and there are a lot of videos on YouTube that it's of like the culminating activities, almost like graduation, if you will, at the end of the semester. And Living in Canaan Now is one of the most commonly performed songs at the end of that
It is.
semester. I've seen a lot of different quartets perform it, and everybody kind of brings their own take to it. And you did it kind of more the way your family had passed it down.
Right, passed down, especially the turnaround. That's the way that the family always played it.
Right.
My great grandfather knew J.R. Baxter.
Gotcha.
That was how he published some of his music, and he knew him personally. And it'll say on there J.R. Baxter and Claude H. Center.
Right, I saw that. Yeah,
yeah.
in the hymnal. And I mentioned Stamps Baxter in the singing school, so also you can find it on YouTube by the Gaithers with getting close to 2 million views. So the song is very well known. Now, the group that's most known for the song would be
The Happy Goodmans.
Happy Goodmans. That's who had, I guess you'd say, the big hit.
The big hit with it. It really took off with them. Yeah.
Now, of course, by then your great grandfather, I believe, was passed.
Had already passed away. Claude died in 1963, and it was such a big shock to the community. He died of a massive heart attack. His obituary was published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Wow.
It was such a big ordeal. A lot of people came to that funeral. That was before my time, but I've heard a lot about it. Even growing up in the community as a kid, I was born in 1988, so a full 25 years, 63, 73, 83, and 5 more years, a full 25 years later, people still talked about that CH's great-grandson. And I can hear people to this day talk about him playing in church. They said he would play a piano so much and he'd taking the keys off of it, and that the piano itself would dance. He was a big-time piano player. He was pretty big-time business owner. This is kind of funny, but during that time period, and we're talking in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and the end of the 60s, C.H. Center's dry goods store and C.H. Center Incorporated, whatever it was, Centers Incorporated, was listed with Dun and Bradstreet. So he talked to a lot of people. It was a big pillar of that community at that time. Him and about 4 other business owners that were Christians. It was 3 Baptists and a Catholic, if you can believe that, and they were still good friends.
That's good.
All of them good friends, and that's the beginnings of what we're going to talk about in just a moment.
Gotcha. So, not only a great gospel musician, songwriter, but obviously clearly a Christian man who left his mark in a lot of different ways, just in the community and through his business dealings. And so, Josh, when you hear the opening, or at least for me, when I hear the opening, and I think the average listener hearing the opening verse of Living in Canaan now, you probably imagine that the speaker in that song is maybe someone who just accepted Christ, or maybe joined the church for the first time. But that's not really the situation that was going on.
No.
Now, you mentioned already the tragic loss of what would have been your grandfather's brother, older brother. But tell us what else was going on, and in terms of church life with your great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, again, married, had their first son, William, who died suddenly as an infant. They go through that dark period of time in grief and loss. They have my grandfather in 1936. And somewhere around this time period, I believe it was maybe 1937 or 38, a young man ordained by God to preach, felt called to preach, came down to Copper Hill, McKaysville, and started preaching on the streets the Word of God. Now, there's another, if anybody out there wants to hear some of the history about how deep the divide was between Copper Hill and McKaysville. McKaysville was a dry town. Alcohol was outlawed. It was a very upstanding, upright, decent running community. You cross the line into Copper Hill, you're into the mining town. There was alcohol, there was gambling, there was a lot of other nefarious things going on.
Wow.
And there is a book that just came out recently called The Biggs Machine. And it talks about the sheriff of Polk County named Birch Biggs and his deputies. Anyway,
A lot of corruption.
Politically. Graft. They got away with murders, stuff like that. It was pretty rough deal. And so Copper Hill didn't cotton too kindly, to coin a phrase, to a street preacher preaching to the various vices
that were going
that
on.
were going on.
And the
And
preacher's
on the
name-
streets. The preacher's name was a young man by the name of Lee Key, Preacher Lee Key, and we've got some pictures Paul's going to share with you on there. And he would get out on the streets and preach, and Copper Hill wouldn't put up with it, and they arrested him
Wow.
for preaching on the streets. And my grandfather and Katrina's great-grandfather, Luther Abernathy, and the other man named last name of Jabley. He owned the store down there in McKaysville, Copper Hill as well. Mr. Jabley Sr. Would go and they would bail him out. And he'd go right back to preaching that very same day, and then they would arrest him, and then my group would go, my grandfather and those gentlemen would go bail him out. And the picture you're about to see is standing right outside City Hall and the jail after they posted bail for him the sixth time. And every time they'd go back and get him, more people would come in and pitch in, and more people would come in and pitch in, and more people would come in and pitch in. And that's the crew of people that was coming and posting bail for Lee Key.
And we'll show kind of the present day City Hall there. And that is a really big group. Now, he wasn't just, I'm sure he was preaching, sometimes just him standing there, but he also had a way of getting his message broadcasted a little bit louder.
Yes.
So what did
He
do?
had a car that he had affixed speakers to the outside of. Now, we're talking in the 40s, so this was probably a late 30s model, early 40s model car. And, of course, you've got World War II in the middle of all this. But he had loudspeakers rigged up on the side of his car. And for a while, he would park on the other side of the line on the bridge, or around off the bridge, but on the other side of the line, and aim his car towards the beer joints and preach from his car on the loudspeaker.
Oh,
He also had records that he would play for his altar calls. He would play records and then he would preach.
so he was getting his message over there, and they couldn't come across the line and arrest him.
No, but they would
'Cause that's
catch
a
him as soon
different-
as he crossed the line.
Okay. Now,
And
which county was he a resident of?
You know what? I don't know. I know he was originally from Ellijay. He was originally
Okay.
from Ellijay, Georgia, but now I don't know if he was living in McKaysville and driving over to Copper Hill or in Copper Hill and came back
So
over.
in his travels, if he crossed into Polk County,
He was arrested
he
on the
would
spot.
be arrested, but he could park his car just across the line, fire up his loudspeakers,
And preach.
and then he could be heard in both counties. Now, this directly affected your grandfather, because as you said, he had bailed him out. What negative consequence then happened to your grandfather,
Yeah,
your
great-grandfather.
Claude? What happened to him as a negative consequence for bailing out Lee Keys?
He was a deacon of his church at the time. He'd gone through losing his first child. This street preacher comes along and he's helping him out, and because of the politics of the day and helping a non-denominational preacher, and you also have to understand the big Pentecostal movement was starting just a few miles to the north over here in Turtletown and in Liberty, North Carolina, right out through that way. So that's where all this was going on and coming this way. And so they turned him out of church.
So we're going to pause right here for just a second, and because some of our listeners might not really know what that means. So to be turned out of church would basically mean that you're no longer a member. You're kind of banned from the church. And sometimes that can be done for, reasons where the church felt like you had engaged in something immoral. But this time it was for bailing out a street preacher of a different denomination.
Bailing him out and supporting him in his tent revival.
And it was particularly, I would imagine, hurtful to your great-grandfather because...
Well, that's his church. Number one, they're trying to get souls saved, and just the real hurt to it all was there's his newborn son buried in that church cemetery, and now he's no longer welcome
Wow.
to come to that church.
The timing, it's just
and
terrible.
and I think his parents were buried in that in that cemetery as well. So he has his family and his roots in that church, but he's been
severed.
He's been severed from that. He's dealing with the grief of his firstborn. He's supporting this preacher, and he sits down at the piano. And this, according to the story in my family's told, he wrote that song with my grandfather sitting in his lap as an infant. He composed the words, "Egypt was once my home. I was a slave, helpless and sin did roam. Love life did crave. But when I looked up to heaven's dome, Christ came to save. I'm living in Canaan now." And every verse talks about being bound and finding redemption and living a life of liberty.
Mm-hmm. Takes that metaphor of the children of Israel in bondage in Egypt and then being led out by Moses, and then applies that, of course, to all Christians and the way that Christ, frees us from slavery, from sin, and all really great songs. The foundation of them, I'm sure, comes from reality, and so such a transitional, kind of pivotal moment there in your great grandfather's life, where he was doing the right thing.
Yes.
Now, I knew, for a little while, I knew about the turning out and the street preacher, but then as you've shared more and more, and we've kind of dug into it more and more, I remember at the time, I pictured in my mind, and I guess that's shame on me for kind of having stereotypical notions, but for the street preacher, I kind of pictured a really rough, kind of wild
John
character.
the Baptist type.
Yeah, and then of course then I see these pictures of this nice, clean cut young man, and it's different. And so then my mind starts turning. Were they that serious about the denomination being different? Was that the sole reason for turning out? It's hard to know, but people were turned out of church for kind of sometimes almost silly things, like my dad, Pap, as you know him on the channel, told me about a church very near to where I live now who turned a man out for fishing. He wasn't drinking, he wasn't cheating on his wife, nothing, just super immoral, but he went fishing on a Sunday and they turned him out, banned him from the church.
They were very strict on stuff in those days.
And in this situation, there's no way to know, but I can't help but wonder if there weren't some political things also, that it wasn't maybe just about the denomination, because these counties are, they're right there together. And you talk about the Biggs machine and the political power there in Polk County, and oftentimes people might live in one county but work in another, or live in one and go to church in another. And part of me wonders, was there pressure on the deacons politically over Lee Keys in that situation?
Probably so. And again, this was a non-denominational tent revival they had, and they wanted it out of town. They wanted it away from, they didn't want to deal with it, and it just kept growing and kept growing and kept growing.
Now, your great-grandfather, after he was turned out of that church, which we won't name,
right,
he helped start another church.
That's the Tent Revival with Lee Key and a few others, and forgive me, I don't know the names. I've been told them, but
Sure.
If I should have paid more attention growing up to all these old stories, and that I do regret. But the story that does stick prevalent with me, now this is the late 30s into the 40s, so you got the Depression into World War II, a tent revival, and everything going on in America at that time. Those were some hard times. Mm-hmm. And I know here recently this country's been through some hard times like COVID and everything else, but we're talking about some really, really hard times. Mm-hmm. So the revival broke out. People turned to God, and so they had this tent revival, and they just kept it going, and it became and morphed into a church. They don't have the money during World War II with all the building restrictions, so they just kept that church as a tent, great old big tent on a lot out in now Kingtown, and Kingtown and McKaysville. And so when after the war and things started getting better, they just built that church, and they named that church the Tabernacle, which, as you know, means tent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of part of that story. And in the basement of that church, there's some pictures of Lee Key and my grandfather. And I know there's a picture of that car with the loudspeakers on the side of it.
I would love to see that one day. Speaking of Lee Key, he did meet a tragic end. That's another kind of detail, I guess, we've looked at and discussed. He was only 28, I believe.
Somewhere around that. He was a young man.
Had a wife and 2 children, and in some of his travels, maybe even going to a church service, who knows, or coming back, I'm not sure, but his car was stalled out on the railroad track, and he was struck by a train and killed. And you were talking with somebody familiar with kind of the history of this area, and they were sharing that he had a car full of records.
That's what he would play on the loudspeaker, yeah.
And they were all broken.
Except for one.
And what was the name of the one record that survived the crash?
And they played it at his funeral. Well done, my child, well done.
So when I look back at Lee Keys, I see him as a real inspirational figure. You know, I wasn't alive then. I know he was a controversial figure at that time, but he seems to me like he was doing what the Lord was telling him to do.
He was.
Doesn't mean he went about it perfectly, you know, maybe, but he was doing what the Lord told him to do. And one reason I draw that conclusion is he was putting himself at risk.
Yeah.
He was literally putting himself
For
in
life,
jail.
liberty, and property.
So he
did
clearly
not care.
believed in what he was doing. It's
did.
kind of like the disciples.
He stood for what was right.
So many, and not to compare him on that level, but so many of the disciples, you know, literally gave their lives. So you don't do that. You don't take those kinds of risks if you don't really believe in what you're doing. And you know that the Lord is directing you to do certain things.
And here, 70 years later, several million views on YouTube with that song, and how many lives it's touched. My great-grandfather's been dead since 1963. Lee Key's been dead 70 some odd years. He died in the mid-50s when he passed away, if I remember correctly. These people were powerhouses for the Lord, and here we are still talking about them today.
Their impact.
I'll tell you one more story. My mother shared this with me when I shared with her that we were going to be making this video. My grandfather and Lee Key were very close friends.
Curtis.
And, Claude.
Claude, great-grandfather.
Claude, great-grandfather. Curtis was my grandfather. Sorry. And again, money was hard to come by in those days. And they didn't have social media. They didn't have on social media we get out, we know everything's going on. Such and such has happened. Oh, we're praying. We get a prayer chain together. And that's wonderful. That's great. But they just didn't have that form of communication in those days.
Sure.
And times were getting hard. It was around this time of year. It was getting cold. And Lee Key did not have enough money to pay his light bill. And he had a crawl space in his house that was dirt. It was earth, and houses weren't as well built as they are these days.
Sure.
But he got down in that crawl space and started praying. And my grandfather was in the store. Great grandfather was in the store working. Come to a screeching halt. I've got to go see Lee Key. And he took some money out of the register, and it was just so happened to be enough to pay that light bill. And knocked on the door, and they found him, went in his house and started hunting him, and found him in that crawl space praying.
Wow.
And come on out of here, I've got something for you. And the Lord impressioned me to give you this money. And they shouted all over Copper Hill, but stuff like that, talk about Doyle's book being tuned in. These folks were tuned in. They knew. And how many times have you and I, for instance, text one another or call one another, I've had you on my mind, you all right? Let's just talk a minute. You doing okay? Just a text, a call, a little random acts of kindness, just check in on your friends, look about them, pray for them. Those things are what's holding this whole thing together. I know that for a fact. That's what's holding this whole thing together. So we're talking over 70 years, and we're still talking about it. And there's people on YouTube that's hearing that song to this day, right this minute. Somebody's listening to that, listening to the Goodmans sing it, or what. And One other thing, my great-grandfather wouldn't take any royalties off that song.
Right.
And he said, I work for a living, I sing for the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's going to make any money off that song.
I really respect that. It seems
do
like
too.
you said that to maybe your grandmother, someone told you that he said, won't take money for a song that the Lord gave me
That's
in the
right.
first place. And that's something Doyle talks about a lot, because Doyle's written some beautiful songs, and that's the way he believes, probably correctly so, I think, that the Lord gave him that, blessed him with that song.
That's exactly right.
And so many people have talked about knowing, that they enjoy knowing the background or the history of the song's origin just as much as hearing the song. And I can see why. To me, it makes it a richer experience than when you hear the song. And so I've really enjoyed learning a lot about this song. And I appreciate you sharing all that with me. Appreciate you joining me in these videos. And the Lord loves to take bad things or hard times or problems and bring good out of them. So out of all that stuff that was going on, this song came out of that. From your great-grandfather losing that first child, he and his wife losing that first child, to being turned out of church, to Lee Keys being thrown in prison, to all those things. From all those things, God brought good out of that in the form of this song, and I'm sure in many, many other things that we aren't even aware of. But thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed that information. I know that you probably did. And we'll leave you with the first take that we tried of Living in Canaan Now. And thanks for watching.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Look out. Right. Good ones.
There you go.
We'll be the extra happy.
Extra happy, dude.
Yeah, extra happy. You know what? I wouldn't look good with a beehive haircut. Be up there.
That'd be a little weird. Yeah.
Go by. Gladness to find. All right.
Egypt was once my home, I was a slave. Helpless and sin did roam, no blood did crave. But when I looked up to heaven's dome, Christ came to save. I'm living in Canaan now. Living in Canaan now.
Egypt behind,
Cross over Jordan wide.
gladness to find.
My soul is satisfied, no longer I am blind. Living with Jesus up in Canaan right now. Satan may have you bound with fetters strong. Look up to higher ground. Do not be long to Christ the Savior. Your soul is found. You sing this song. I'm living in Canaan now. Living in Canaan now.
Egypt behind,
Cross over Jordan wide.
gladness to find.
My soul is satisfied. No longer I am blind. Living with Jesus up in Canaan right now.
So I didn't know if y'all wanted me to keep on soloing.